What's the Use of Poetry? By Richard Le Gallienne. From The World's Best Poetry, Volume 7, Descriptive and Narrative, Part 1. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Adrian Stevens.
Craig Franklin.
Sonia.
Thomas Peter.
And Jason in Canada.
What's the use of poetry? And idly tuneful, the loquacious throng flutter and twitter, prodigal of time, and little masters make a toy of song, till grave men weary of the sound of rhyme. William Watson in Wordsworth's Grave. There is no doubt that many, one might almost say most, people are firmly convinced that they do not care for poetry. They have no use for it, they tell you. Either it bores them as a fantastic, high-flown method of saying something that, to their way of thinking, could be better said in plain prose, or they look upon it as the sentimental nonsense of the moonstruck and lovesick young, a kind of intellectual candy, all very well for women and children, but of no value to grown men with the serious work of the world on their shoulders. It is not at all difficult to account for, and indeed to sympathize with this attitude. To begin with, of course, there is a large class outside our present considerations which does not care for poetry, simply because it does not care for any literature whatsoever. Serious reading of any kind does not enter into its scheme of life. Beyond the newspapers and magazines and an occasional novel of the hour, idly taken up and indifferently put aside, it has no literary needs. With this listless multitude we have not to concern ourselves, but rather with that sufficiently heterogeneous body known as the reading public, the people for whom Mr. Carnegie builds libraries, and the publishers display their wares. Of course, among these there must necessarily be a considerable percentage temperamentally unappreciative of poetry, just as there are numbers of people born with no ear for music, and numbers, again, born with no colour sense. The lover of poetry is no less born than the poet himself, yet, as the poet is made as well as born, so is his reader, and there are many who really love poetry without knowing it, but who think they do not care for it, either because they have contracted the wrong notion of what poetry is, or because they have some time or other made a bad start with the wrong kind. I am convinced that one widespread provocative of the prevailing impression of the foolishness of poetry is the mediocre magazine verse of the day. In an age when we go so much to the magazines for our reading, we may rely on finding there the best work being done in every branch of literature except the highest. The best novelists, the best historians, and the best essayists write for the magazines, but the best poets must be looked for in their high-priced volumes, and a magazine reader must rely for his verse on lady amateurs and tuneful college boys. Thus he too often approaches poetry not through the great masters but through the little misses, and he forms his naturally contemptuous notion of poetry from feeble echoes and insipid imitations. No wonder, therefore, that he should refuse to waste his good eyesight on anything in the shape of verse, and should conceive of poetry as a mild mental dissipation for young ladies, a sickly sweetmeat made of molasses and moonshine. If the magazine editors of the world would only bind themselves to publish no verse except the best, and, failing to obtain a contemporary supply of the best, would fill their spare corners of space with reprints of the old fine things, I am convinced that they would do a great deal toward rectifying this widespread misconception of an art which, far from being trivial and superficial, is, of all the arts, the most serious and most vitally human. I am not saying that all poetry is for all readers. There is a section of poetry which has been called poet's poetry, which of necessity can appeal only to those in whom the sense of beauty and verbal exquisiteness has become specialized. Spenser and Keats, for example, are poets of the rainbow. For the average reader, their poems are the luxuries rather than the necessities of literature, though, in making a distinction so rough and ready, it must not be forgotten
Sample complete. Ready to continue?